Security dragged a black CEO off a plane for a random inspection, but hours later, he pulled $5 billion in funding and grounded the airline for good. They thought dragging him off the plane would prove their control. They didn't realize the man they humiliated financed half their fleet. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always crashes on takeoff. The moment Julian Maris stepped into the jet bridge, the air shifted. He felt it before he saw it. The slight turn of strangers' heads, the curious glance from a gate agent, the subtle hush of conversation fading behind him. He didn't slow down. His hand stayed steady on the strap of his backpack, his polished shoes tapping quietly against the metal floor. The boarding door to the aircraft was only a few feet ahead, glowing with the soft reflection of overhead lamps. That door represented everything he had planned for today. The critical meeting in Corvin City, the chance to secure the $5 billion Cyrex grant, and the opportunity to expand Virulon's humanitarian technologies across continents. He was seconds away from boarding when two airport security officers stepped forward, blocking his path. "Sir, we need you to step aside," one of them said. His voice was low, almost rehearsed. He didn't look Julian in the eyes. Instead, his gaze hovered somewhere near Julian's shoulder, as though acknowledging him directly was somehow uncomfortable. Julian stopped, his brow tightening by a fraction. "Step aside for what?" he asked, his tone calm, polite but firm. His voice echoed faintly in the narrow jet bridge, drawing the attention of passengers behind him. A few tried not to stare. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. "There's been a report," the second officer said. He was younger, taller, and visibly uneasy. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand resting awkwardly near his radio. His eyes kept darting between Julian and the airline door, as if he wished this duty belonged to someone else. Julian's fingers loosened on the backpack strap, but his shoulders remained level. "Report of what?" he asked, his tone still controlled. Every word was measured. Years of leading boardrooms had trained him to mask irritation with precision. The younger officer cleared his throat. "You matched a description." His voice trailed off at the end, as if even he wasn't convinced by what he was saying. He didn't specify the description, and he didn't need to. Julian had seen this pattern before: vague wording, unspecific suspicion, and a quiet assumption that required no explanation. Passengers behind Julian slowed their steps, creating an inadvertent audience. A middle-aged man near the back whispered to his companion, and the whisper carried farther than intended in the cramped space. The gate agent at the aircraft door glanced over, her expression tight with confusion. "This won't take long," the older officer added, lifting a hand as if offering reassurance. But his stance betrayed something else: hesitation, defensiveness, maybe even fear of being questioned further. "Just come with us for a moment." Julian looked past them at the boarding door, so close he could almost feel the cool pressurized air seeping through the narrow gap. That door was the dividing line between his plan succeeding and falling apart. A 2-hour delay would cost him the meeting window. Missing the meeting entirely could derail the final stage of the Cyrex grant. But walking away wasn't an option. Neither was arguing. He inhaled once, quietly. "Then let's be quick," he said. His tone was level, but something in the way he spoke caused both officers to stiffen. The words held no threat, no anger, just a control so steady it unsettled them. The younger officer's hand twitched at his side. The older one nodded silently, stepping aside to let Julian pass between them. As they escorted him back through the jet bridge, the hallway felt colder than before. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, washing everything in pale tones. Julian walked without resistance, but his mind sharpened. He scanned every detail: the uneven texture of the walls, the faint smell of jet fuel, the tightness in the officers' voices, as if all of it were pieces of a puzzle he'd soon have to assemble. Something wasn't right. The steps behind him didn't match the rhythm of casual procedure. The officers weren't talking to each other, weren't explaining, weren't guiding, they were rushing. And yet no urgency showed on their faces. Only discomfort, only silence. Julian knew that this moment was more than an inconvenience. It carried the weight of something unspoken, something rooted in instinct rather than fact. something that had likely placed him on their mental checklist long before he stepped into the jet bridge. One passenger, an older man with silver hair and a briefcase, watched as Julian was led away. Their eyes met for a half-second. Recognition flickered. He knew who Julian was, but he didn't speak. He simply stepped aside. Julian didn't break eye contact until the officers turned him fully toward the terminal exit, cutting off his view of the plane. The boarding door disappeared behind a wall of glass and metal. His chance at making the flight slipped away with it. Yet despite the rising tension, Julian's heartbeat remained steady. He'd faced boardroom ambushes, hostile acquisitions, and international scrutiny. But there was something different about being pulled aside without explanation. Something colder. Something that pressed on a deeper part of him, one that remembered smaller humiliations long before he ever became CEO. Still, he didn't raise his voice, didn't resist, didn't give them the reaction they might have expected. He walked with them, every step measured, every breath calm, his silence a shield sharper than anger. And as the doors to the terminal hallway closed behind him, shutting out the aircraft he should have been boarding, one thought echoed quietly in the back of his mind. A warning, a promise, and a storm gathering in silence. Sometimes, the quietest man carries the loudest storm. The door clicked shut behind him. Julian Maris sat down slowly, placing his backpack on the floor beside the plastic chair with deliberate care. The room was stark, an off-white box echoing fluorescent hums, the corners stained by time and bureaucratic neglect. A single table stood between him and the two men who brought him here, one older, with a stiff walk and badge labeled Corgan, and the other younger, barely speaking, eyes flickering between the wall and the floor. Vale, his name tag read. Neither sat immediately. Just a quick chat, sir, said Officer Brant Corgan, forcing a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. You're not under arrest. This is a precaution. Julian didn't move. His voice remained composed, even-toned. Precaution for what? There was a pause. The silence felt too intentional. You matched a description, Corgan replied, flipping open a small notebook but never writing in it. What description? Julian asked, eyes steady on the man. Height? Race? Confidence? That made Vale shift. He looked up briefly, then quickly turned his gaze away again. A beat passed. Corgan cleared his throat and gestured toward the backpack at Julian's feet. Mind if we take a look? Julian exhaled through his nose. No lawyer. No explanation. No reason. Just a room, a vague suspicion, and a power imbalance pretending to be polite. Go ahead, he said. Corgan opened the bag with care, as if he expected it to hiss. Inside were white papers stamped with bioethical clearance, a leather-bound notebook, 2 conference binders labeled Cyrex Summit Q4, and a sleek black badge with an embedded chip, Cyrex Foundation Level 7 authorization. Corgan lifted it out like it might burn him. What's this for? He asked. Access, Julian said plainly. Cyrex security clearance. I'm meeting with them today in Corvin. Corgan set the badge down and looked at Vale. Vale said nothing. His hand hovered near his hip radio, but he didn't reach for it. What's your profession? Corgan asked. Julian locked eyes with him. SB. Virulon Systems. That stopped the air for a moment. Vali Blinkid. The biotech firm? His voice cracked slightly, either from nerves or embarrassment. Yes, Julian said. The one working with Cyrex to reduce pediatric diagnostic delays globally. The one you've just delayed. Corgan chuckled, but the sound was empty. Just doing our jobs, sir. Julian rose slowly, brushing a crease from his jacket sleeve. His calm made the silence louder. And I'm about to do mine. He stepped toward the door, expecting it to open. Didn't. Vale had shifted to block it, though not aggressively, just enough to send a message. Not yet, Corgan muttered. He didn't offer a reason. He didn't need to. Julian's jaw flexed once, subtly. Not in anger, but calculation. His eyes traced the edges of the room, the chipped paint behind the mounted camera, the way the buzzing light flickered every 3rd second. None of it surprised him. Not the vague accusation. Not the selective courtesy. And not the room itself, sterile, quiet, a controlled space meant to look impartial while quietly reminding the subject of their place. "You've seen my ID, my badge, my destination," Julian said, voice sharp as glass but still quiet. "And yet we're still here." Vale shifted again. There was just a protocol. Julian gave him a glance that wasn't cruel, but it wasn't forgiving either. "Tell me," he said, "did that protocol trigger before or after you saw my skin color?" Neither officer answered. Corgan looked back down at the table. "You'll be free to go shortly. Just need confirmation on something from dispatch." But they hadn't called dispatch. Julian had counted the clicks on Vale's radio. It had only been adjusted, not used. This wasn't about a report. This was about delay. Delay disguised as duty. Interruption sold as standard procedure. The real reason hung in the air between them, unspoken and undignified. Julian turned and sat again, not because he had to, but because they hadn't earned the symbolism of him standing. The longer they stalled, the more damage they would soon regret. But he said nothing. Silence, he'd learned, was often louder than outrage. He folded his hands, rested them lightly on the table, and stared straight ahead. He didn't tap, didn't shift, didn't flinch. And in that moment, what power he had in boardrooms and billion-dollar deals meant nothing. Because here in this room, respect had no price tag, and assumptions had no consequence. Here, power didn't matter. And that was the point. Some rooms are built to remind you that respect is still optional. Julian stood just outside the terminal holding room, the dull clang of the door clicking shut behind him. The air felt heavier than before. Gate B12 loomed ahead, still bright under fluorescent lights, still loud with announcements. But the plane was gone. Through the glass, Flight 847 to Corvin City had already pushed off the jetway, its wings slicing into a sky that no longer held a seat for him. Julian's eyes locked briefly on the empty boarding bridge, then on the large overhead screen confirming what he already knew. Departed. On time. He had missed it. Seat 2A, first class. The one he'd quietly chosen to keep a low profile. The one that now sat unoccupied. Down the corridor, a gate agent paced behind the counter, speaking into a handheld radio. He looked up, startled as Julian approached. "Mr. Maris, sir, we didn't realize," the young man stammered. His badge read Colin. Julian said nothing at first. His gaze slid past Colin to the retractable belts still forming the line he was never allowed to pass through. Passengers were long gone. Only silence lingered. Then he spoke, quietly but with precision. "You didn't realize after the fact. But you made decisions before you ever knew my name." Colin's lips parted, apology ready to spill, but Julian raised a single finger. His expression didn't need volume. "What you assumed before you knew, that's what matters." He didn't wait for a reply. Outside the boarding area, a buzz of motion and announcements continued. Travelers dragged roller bags across the tile floors, oblivious to the storm building behind Julian's quiet demeanor. He walked steadily past the coffee kiosks and window displays, the terminal's brightness unable to touch the sharpness in his thoughts. His phone buzzed. Darian Holt's name flashed on the screen. Julian answered without breaking stride. "Julian? Cyrex just called. They said you haven't landed yet. Are you still at the airport?" There was a pause on the line. Then, low and incredulous, "You missed the flight? I wasn't allowed to board." The words were like sand dropped into a still pond. "No Rus. No emotion. Just wait." Darian's breath caught. "You weren't. Wait, what happened? Are you all right? I thought." "I'm fine," Julian replied evenly. "They pulled me aside, held me in a room, said I matched a description. No actual report. Just matched." Darian swore under his breath. "That's Julian, that's absurd. You cleared pre-check. You're in the system. You built part of that plane." "I told them," Julian said, voice calm as always. "Didn't matter. Not in that moment. What do we do? Should I call Cyrex back? They're trying to hold the session. But we can't delay this long, this grant. It's not a setback. Julian said, stepping onto the moving walkway, his reflection gliding beside him on the glass barrier. Darian's voice dropped to a whisper. Then what is it? A signal. Darian fell silent. He understood the tone. Julian's calm always meant the same thing. Plans were forming, and someone would soon feel the chill of being precisely outmaneuvered. At the far end of the terminal, Julian turned into a quiet alcove near baggage claim. No one noticed him anymore. Without a scene, without a badge, without anger, he had vanished from the plane, but not from control. He took a seat on a low bench, leaned forward, and pulled out his tablet. Fingerprint unlock. Opened files. Checked timestamps. Confirmed that Cyrex's session had been officially delayed by 2 hours. Still enough time to pivot. He tapped out a message to Reese Calder. Change of venue. I'll host the meeting personally at Virulon HQ. Security clearance on arrival. I'll explain. Then another message to Darian. Prep the North Boardroom. We're no longer asking for partnership. We're directing it. Across the terminal, the security team that had removed him now sat quietly in their office. Officer Brant Corgan filled out a vague report. Subject removed due to possible mismatch to flagged identity. No further incident. Officer Renard Vale hadn't spoken much since Julian left. He kept glancing at the television in the break room, which now looped an ad for Virulon's AI health initiative, Julian's face front and center. Think we messed up? Vale asked finally, his voice low. Corgan grunted. Protocol. Vale didn't reply. Something about the way Julian had looked at them, unafraid, unreadable, still lingered, as if the man already saw the board, and they were just pawns stepping where they were meant to. Hours later, Darian met Julian in the executive suite of Virulon's downtown tower. You walked out without even raising your voice, Darian said, handing him a fresh suit jacket. Julian adjusted the collar. No need. Their reaction was louder than anything I could have said. Darian sat down, brows furrowed. The delay, it was an insult. Julian turned toward the window, eyes fixed on the skyline as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the buildings. He thought of that empty seat, 2A, and the quiet calculation behind every missed opportunity. No, he said, voice measured. It was a decision. He turned, eyes clear with intention. Now I'll make mine. The footage began like so many that came before it, shaky, quiet, almost forgettable. But what it showed was anything but. Julian Maris walked silently between 2 airport security officers, his hands relaxed at his sides, expression unreadable. A few feet behind them, a man in a business coat held his phone up, capturing the scene from just behind the boarding line. You could hear the murmur ripple across the passengers. Isn't that the Virulon guy? Someone whispered. In the footage, Julian didn't resist. He didn't protest. He simply walked, his navy suit still crisp, his silence louder than any outburst. No context, no reason, just a calm, black man in a high-security area, being removed without explanation. By the time the clip hit the internet 2 hours later, it had already collected over 500,000 views. The caption was blunt. Black CEO pulled off plane. No reason given. This America? It trended within the hour. But while the public gasped and speculated, Julian had already shifted into motion. At a high rise across town, Darian Holt, Julian's executive assistant, stared at his phone with clenched teeth. This is going viral, he muttered, pacing beside the windows of Virulon's press wing. He tapped out a message and paused before hitting send. They lit the match. He's already laying out the firebreak. Miles away, inside a sleek, glass-walled office, Julian sat at his desk with the same calm he had shown during the incident. He dialed a private number. Reese Calder, answered the voice on the other end. Reese, Julian said smoothly. We're shifting the location. The meeting. Reese sounded surprised. We already. To my office, Julian cut in. Your team delayed it out of courtesy to the airport disruption, but they haven't earned that courtesy. Reese hesitated. Julian, is this personal now? Julian's eyes flicked toward the muted television mounted in the corner of his office, which now showed a news ticker crawling beneath the headline. Virulon CO pulled from plane, investigation ongoing. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of everything pressing invisibly against his shoulders. "It's professional," he replied evenly. "But I'll admit, it's getting clearer who deserves the future." Reese didn't reply immediately. Julian heard nothing but the hum of city traffic in the background. Then, quietly, Reese said, "We'll be there by 10. Julian hung up without another word. At the airport, meanwhile, the situation was escalating faster than the security team had anticipated. Officer Brant Corgan sat in a cluttered back office, watching the footage play on a small monitor. His partner, Renard Vale, leaned against the wall behind him, arms crossed tight. "This wasn't supposed to go public," Vale muttered. "It always goes public," Corgan replied, rubbing his temples. "Someone always has a phone. What do we even write in the report?" Vale asked, voice low. "There was no match. The system pinged once and cleared. We just kept going." Corgan didn't answer. The terminal's overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the walls. A knock on the door interrupted them. A supervisor stepped in. "You're both being flagged for preliminary review," he said tersely. "The Board of Aviation Ethics wants internal notes. Immediately." Corgan frowned. "Over what?" The supervisor's face was stone. "Over everything." As the review began, a larger wave was already building. News sites picked up the clip. Twitter users began identifying Julian by name and status. Business pages posted side-by-side comparisons of him at biotech summits and in that low-res footage being escorted like a threat. Memes appeared, followed by op-eds, then by outrage. But none of it came from Julian. He didn't tweet. He didn't issue a press statement. He didn't grant interviews. Instead, he met with Darien in the Virulon strategy room later that evening. The room was dim, only the whiteboard aglow with lines and figures. Julian stood near the windows, staring out at the lights of the city. "They're calling for a boycott," Darien said, scrolling through his tablet. A few trade journals already pulled Deltamon ads from their next issues. Julian didn't look away from the skyline. "Don't encourage it." Darien blinked. "But we're not canceling anyone," Julian said calmly. "We're just building without them." Darien fell silent, watching his boss with new eyes. There was no anger in Julian, only intent. Measured, deliberate, surgical intent. He had no need to scream. He was already working on the part that would echo louder than headlines. Outside, the world debated if this was racism, if it was a mistake, if it was just a misunderstanding. Inside, Julian rearranged the map. "You're not letting it slide," Darien said finally. "No," Julian said softly, almost to himself. "I'm letting it show." Then he turned, tapped the board twice, and began outlining new logistics pathways that bypassed every service connected to Crestlane security. Across the room, the screen still glowed faintly with paused footage. Julian, walking with quiet dignity toward a back room he never should have entered. Darien watched it one last time and whispered, "They pulled you off the plane for being who you are." Julian didn't look at the screen. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked past it. "Power doesn't vanish," he said as he stepped out of the room. "It just steps off the plane to make a new runway." Julian didn't wait for a welcome. The boardroom door eased shut behind him, muting the soft hum of the Virulon Executive Tower. Across the polished table, the Cyrex Foundation delegation had already taken their seats. Briefcases opened, tablets powered, expressions measured but expectant. Reese Calder, the Foundation's funding director, sat at the center. His fingers paused mid-click on a stylus as Julian walked in, the screen behind him still glowing with the day's greeting. "Integrity before comfort, a Virulon core value." Julian didn't sit. Not yet. He dropped a small, leather-bound folder onto the table with deliberate calm and locked eyes with Reese. "Before we continue," he said, voice level, "your foundation funds innovation for dignity, equity, and long-term human welfare. Is that still your mission?" Reese blinked, caught off guard by the abrupt beginning. He slowly closed his tablet, nodding. It is. Then here's my request, Julian said, his hand resting firmly on the folder. Pull the entire $5 billion fund from Deltamon Airlines. Reallocate it to us. The room went still. The fluorescent lighting buzzed faintly above the silence that followed. Reese leaned back. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was cautious. That would be a dramatic redirection. Julian nodded once. Yes, but necessary. Deltamon owns Crestlane Security. There was a rustle of suits, an audible inhale from one of the junior delegates. Julian's eyes never left Reese's. They're the ones who pulled me off that plane, Julian continued. Without cause, without record, just assumption. He spoke without anger, but the steel beneath his tone cut through the air. And now that assumption has a price. A delegate across the table, thin, gray-haired, and clearly unnerved, interjected. That contract's already under negotiation with Deltamon. Logistics, fleet coordination, medical routing. So is your reputation, Julian interrupted, turning slightly to meet the man's gaze. And this is a negotiation of values. He finally opened the folder. Inside were two documents. The first was Virulon's ethical charter, printed on crisp ivory paper with highlighted sections. Equity-driven design protocols, minority-led research teams, and a strict human oversight clause in all AI deployment. The second was a forecasting model, an animated projection already loaded onto a tablet, which Julian passed across the table. Reese tapped the screen. The numbers were staggering. A projected 42% reduction in medical waiting times across 17 nations over the next 5 years. A potential to increase mobile diagnostic access in conflict zones by 60%. Julian let the data breathe, saying nothing as the implications settled into the room. This is what your money would do, he said finally. If you choose Virulon. Reese looked up. You realize what you're asking. I realize exactly what I'm offering. Julian's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You fund innovation, but they embarrassed your principles. They detained the very future you're supposed to support. Let us honor those principles instead. The room held its breath. Even the clatter of traffic below the high-rise windows seemed to vanish. One man scribbled notes without raising his eyes. Another flipped anxiously through the charter again, as if searching for something that could give them permission to say yes. Reese leaned forward at last, folding his hands. You're not here for revenge, he said carefully. Julian nodded, slow and steady. No. I'm here to teach them the cost of false assumptions. He looked once more at the projection on the screen, the blueprint of change he was already building. Sometimes, Julian said, and this time his voice was barely above a whisper, the only way to fix the runway is to change the plane entirely. The headline hit global financial wires before sunrise. Virulon secures $5 billion from Cyrex, cutting Deltamon from funding pipeline. The ripple was instant. Within 20 minutes of the article's release, Deltamon Airlines pre-market stock dropped 11%. By the time the New York Exchange opened, investor forums were ablaze, scrambling for answers. Inside Deltamon's corporate tower, red lights blinked across dashboards. The communications director barked into 3 phones simultaneously. Get me the crisis protocol, no, the updated one. But it was already too late. Julian Maris hadn't called a press conference. He didn't need to. He let the truth speak in one line, quietly posted from his verified account across every platform. The future doesn't board through bias. Nothing more. No hashtags. No pictures. Just a sentence. And somehow that silence was louder than any speech. By noon, it had been reposted over 2.1 million times, quoted by journalists, reposted by celebrities, and translated into over 40 languages. Back at Crestlane Security, the ripple turned into a riptide. Officer Brant Corgan and Officer Renard Vale sat across from an internal investigator in a windowless review room. The walls were plain, but the tension was sharp enough to cut skin. On the table sat the original security report, thin, vague, and already unraveling. There was no match to any active alert or flagged individual. the investigator said, flipping through the document slowly. No facial ID ping. No behavioral report. No verified threat markers. He looked up. So I'm going to ask once. What exactly did you see that made you stop Mr. Julian Maris? Corgan shifted in his seat, his jaw flexing. It was a gut instinct. The room stilled. Vale blinked, trying not to meet anyone's eyes. The investigator leaned forward, voice low now. Was the instinct tied to his skin or his suit? Neither officer responded. Not in words, but the silence hung thick, heavier than any confession. Outside the room, the hallway seemed even colder than when Julian had walked through it just 2 days prior. Meanwhile, on the 24th floor of the Virulon Systems headquarters, Julian stood at the front of a glass-paneled operations room. Behind him, on a massive screen, the Cyrex funds were already being reallocated in real time across a world map. Urban centers in Flint, Camden, and Memphis lit up with red target markers, each one representing a new beneficiary of Project Aegis. Marcus, Julian said, turning to his head of operations, Marcus Wren, deploy the first wave of diagnostic units to the hospitals on this list, and prioritize speed over ceremony. I want machines in motion before they cut another ribbon anywhere else. Marcus nodded sharply. Understood. We'll start with Haven, then go regional. Julian glanced at the map. We won't just rise, he said, voice quiet but decisive. We'll lift. Across the city, Darian Holt, Julian's executive assistant, watched news stations replaying the original footage of Julian being escorted from the gate. A local station had overlaid the video with the headline, "The man who built the plane they denied." Darian muted the volume, eyes scanning his tablet. Messages from Crestlane's intermediaries were already piling up, some veiled in diplomacy, others in desperation. They're asking for a meeting, Darian said over a secure line. Julian's voice on the other end was calm. Then they can keep asking. They're offering to apologize, in private, and they want to. Julian cut in, steady and surgical. They'll reach me, he said, but not before they remember how far I had to walk just to be heard. Bennett Core gripped the edge of the polished oak table in Deltamon's boardroom as the shouting began. We lost a $5 billion partnership over what? A shareholder demanded, his face red with disbelief. Another banged his fist on the table. Do you understand what that number means for our projections? The room buzzed with tension, papers rustling as if in protest. Bennett, usually confident in a pressed gray suit and silk tie, looked pale and unsteady. He wiped his brow and tried to speak, but the words trembled in his throat. It was a mistake in protocol, he finally said. A chorus of groans followed. Protocol doesn't strip someone from a flight for looking successful, someone muttered bitterly. The slide on the screen behind Bennett still displayed the Cyrex Deltamon partnership announcement, now obsolete. Every word had become a bitter reminder of what they'd just lost. Julian Maris hadn't spoken publicly, but the headlines had. Virulon secured the funding. Deltamon had been cut. No lawsuits, no speeches, just silence and consequences. Behind closed doors, the company scrambled. Their damage control strategy was swift. Suspend officers Corgan and Vale, issue a memo about temporary reassignment, and schedule empathy workshops. But inside Deltamon's PR office, the atmosphere was panicked. Mid-level managers whispered about resignation plans. Junior staff searched job boards. And yet, outside the glass tower in which they had once felt untouchable, something unexpected was brewing. It began with a single sign, respect before boarding. Then another, he built the plane they denied him. By mid-morning, clusters of peaceful protesters began assembling outside major airports. Elridge, Harmon, Cravel Bay. Most held no affiliation with Virulon. They were students, travelers, quiet professionals who'd seen the video of Julian being escorted away for matching a description. The signs weren't angry. They were precise, like the man who'd inspired them. At Virulon's executive tower, Julian ignored all interview requests. News anchors offered full-hour specials. One network even promised him a documentary profile. He declined them all. No narratives, he told Darian. Just altitude. Instead, he moved forward. His eyes were on a different kind of runway. That same afternoon, Julian met with Marcus Wren and two Virulon logistics strategists. "We've had partnerships waiting for clearance," Marcus began. "International medical cargo firms in Varnex, Elza, and South Korath. They've got fleets. We've got diagnostics." Julian nodded once. "It's time. Launch Equitrans." The room fell silent. Everyone understood the weight of that word. Equitrans wasn't just another supply chain contract. It was Julian's vision come to life, a dedicated medical cargo fleet delivering AI-driven diagnostic equipment to under-resourced hospitals across the globe. But more than that, it was personal. The name was chosen in honor of his father, Marlon Maris, a man who spent 30 years delivering mail on foot across the neighborhoods of Calmere Heights. Deliver it with dignity, no matter the address. Marlon used to say when Julian was a boy, watching his father lace up worn-out boots every morning without complaint. Now, that same motto was about to cross oceans. Julian leaned forward in the room, eyes steady. This isn't just about seats or flights. It's about how many are denied altitude before they're even seen. He tapped the table twice, signaling the close of the meeting. But then he paused, glancing toward the floor-to-ceiling window behind him. Across the skyline, airplanes traced arcs of smoke through the sky, each one following a path someone else had programmed. For a moment, his reflection looked like it was floating beside them. He turned back to his team and added, calmly, "They delayed my journey by 40 minutes. I delayed their growth by 5 years." They accused him without cause, calling it protocol, as passengers filmed in silence. If you believe power without accountability deserves exposure, hit subscribe now. Because justice travels farther than pride. The resignation hit the news wires first. Deltamon's chief PR officer, Weston Crail, stepped down without a press briefing, leaving only a sterile 2-sentence statement from the communications office. After careful reflection, Mr. Crail has chosen to pursue other opportunities. We thank him for his service. But the timing was too precise, too transparent. Less than a week after Julian Maris had quietly redirected a $5 billion pipeline, the man responsible for shaping Deltamon's image had vanished from the helm. The apology followed hours later, crafted with the fragility of glass. The incident at Elridge International was an unfortunate overstep and does not reflect our company's values. But the public wasn't buying it. It didn't take a legal analyst to notice the lack of direct acknowledgement, the absence of names, and most importantly, the calculated avoidance of the word profiling. Julian read the apology on his phone as he sat alone in his office. The sun filtered softly through the tinted windows behind him, casting a glow on the minimalist walls. He placed the phone face down and reached for a small note card he kept nearby. In his neat handwriting, he penned 2 words, "Intent speaks." That was all the press memo would say. It was posted to Virulon's social feed at exactly 3 p.m. Within 20 minutes, it had been shared over 300,000 times. Inside Crestlane Security's headquarters, the reaction was very different. Hallway conversations grew quiet when senior officers passed by. A memo had gone out that morning. All agents were now required to undergo empathy recalibration and bias detection training. The irony? The new protocol was authored by Virulon's ethics division, directly reviewed by Marcus Wren. What had begun as a private insult had become a public curriculum. In the break room, Officer Renard Vale sat at the corner table, staring at a laminated copy of the new course modules. His hands were still, but his mind replayed the moment he'd stood awkwardly by the interrogation room door while Julian Maris sat, calm, powerful, precise. He remembered how he hadn't looked him in the eyes. Now the name Julian Maris echoed through every hallway like a quiet verdict. At Cyrex's end, the picture was entirely different. Public response to their pivot toward Virulon was overwhelming. Donations to humanitarian biotech spiked by 170%, and for the first time in a decade, Cyrex received a personal thank you letter from the Health Ministry of Varnora, praising their support of equitable technology access. Rhys Calder, the funding director, sat with his team, reviewing letters pouring in from hospitals, NGOs, and patient advocacy groups. "We didn't just reallocate money," he told his assistant. "We redefined our identity." Outside the storm, Julian remained still. He declined interviews, refused to be photographed, and offered no public statement beyond the two-word memo. But the world couldn't stop talking about him. Journalists began calling him the Crusader in a suit. Articles speculated whether he'd run for office. Headlines tried to capture him in bite-sized summaries. The man who grounded giants, C.O. Maris, and the seat that shook a system, from passenger to policy architect. But the truth was quieter, deeper, more surgical than they understood. One evening, a junior reporter from a regional outlet managed to get an unscheduled question in during a biotech conference where Julian was attending as a quiet observer. "Mr. Maris," he asked, stepping forward with his recorder, "how did it feel, being pulled off that flight?" Julian paused. He could have walked away. Instead, he looked at the young man, his eyes steady but not cold. "Like being reminded," he said softly, "that sometimes the sky is only given to those who know how to build their own wings." Then he turned, walking past the same terminal gate that had once tried to humiliate him, this time with every camera watching. As the security lights reflected briefly across his polished shoes and crisp suit, he murmured to Darian, who stood silently behind him, "The gate hasn't changed," he murmured to Darian. "But I'm not walking through it the same." Julian Maris stepped into the Crestlane Holdings boardroom with the quiet force of a storm that had already made landfall. The leather chairs around the polished obsidian table were filled with executives, some shifting uncomfortably, others pretending calm. His name, etched cleanly into the seating chart at the head of the table, was not a formality. It was a signal. A 12% stake, acquired through Virulon's equity trust, had granted him a voice loud enough to change policy, but it wasn't volume Julian sought. It was standards. He placed a plain black folder in front of him. "No goji logo. No embosetsil." Just one line on the cover, "Flight Ethics. A manifesto for passenger dignity." "Let's begin," he said evenly, his voice slicing through the sterile air. Crestlane's CEO, Marvin Dorr, cleared his throat. "Mr. Maris, while your investment is welcome—" "This isn't about welcome," Julian interrupted, lifting his gaze. "It's about accountability." Dorr's mouth tightened, his knuckles pale as he gripped the edge of the table. The others, the CFO, legal counsel, two operations heads, glanced at each other, weighing strategy against optics. Julian flipped open the manifesto. "This document outlines 14 standards," he began. "From transparent passenger rights disclosures to mandatory de-escalation protocols for all field officers." Marvin tried again, softer. "This might be premature." Julian didn't blink. "I was pulled off a flight you helped oversee. That decision cost your company a $5 billion partnership. That's not premature. That's precedent." He turned the page slowly, the sound deliberate, measured. Clause 9 mandates the automatic removal of officers who detain passengers without filed cause or verifiable threat assessment. Clause 12 requires annual funding, matched dollar for dollar, to communities most affected by travel profiling. I expect it implemented. A long silence followed, broken only by the hum of the central air vents. Marvin leaned back, exhaling. "This sets a high bar." Julian stood slowly, folding the manifesto shut. "That's the point." His eyes swept across the room. "Every system that mistreats us still runs on money. So let's learn to steer that too." The tension cracked then. One of the younger board members, Ellis Rowan, shifted in his seat and said, "If we don't act, we signal we're fine with what happened." Dorr looked at him, surprised. Julian didn't smile, but his eyes settled on Ellis just a moment longer, marking him as someone to remember. When the meeting ended, Julian didn't linger. He exited through the side corridor instead of the main lobby, past a frosted glass wall etched with the company motto. Efficient, secure, global. The irony wasn't lost on him. Outside, a quiet breeze moved through the atrium. The weight of the moment didn't hang heavy on him. It moved with purpose, like a clock finally set to the right time. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered without checking the screen. "You made history," Reese Calder said, his voice slightly awed. Julian looked across the skyline, then down at the suit he wore, the same one from the day they tried to reduce him to suspicion. It still fit. It just meant more now. "I didn't want to make history," Julian replied. "I wanted to make policy." He paused, watching a jet ascend through the clouds above the distant terminal. Because some storms don't shout. They sign checks instead. The hallway outside Ward 6 smelled of antiseptic and quiet hope. Julian Maris stepped through the automatic doors with slow, measured footsteps, the soft hiss of hydraulics fading behind him. His eyes scanned the narrow corridor, soft white walls, a laminated map of Haven General Hospital's pediatric wing, and a row of tired chairs beside a vending machine humming to itself. No reporters. No shareholders. Just healing. He didn't come for applause. He came for impact. Inside the ward, sunlight filtered through slatted blinds, casting soft lines across the polished tile floor. One of Virulon's new AI diagnostic units stood in the corner, a sleek, humming machine with a glowing interface. It was scanning a patient's chart when a young man, mid-30s, stepped out of a nearby room, still in hospital-issued slippers. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face drawn with the fatigue only fear could carve into bone. But when he saw Julian, something shifted. He approached, hesitant but propelled by something deeper than gratitude. "Mr. Maris?" the man asked, voice barely above a whisper. Julian turned, nodded. "Yes, my name's Aaron Phelps, my son. The doctor said your system flagged something the scans missed. Stage 1 neuroblastoma. Caught early." Julian's eyes didn't waver. He listened. He waited. Aaron's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of printed results. They said another week and... His throat caught. "I just wanted to say thank you." Julian placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder. His voice was low, steady. "That's the destination I was always flying toward." Aaron broke into quiet sobs, and Julian held him upright. Not as a CEO, not as a symbol, but as a man who knew what it meant to carry responsibility far beyond the boardroom. Behind them, the AI unit blinked silently, working, healing, doing what it was always meant to do. Outside the hospital, the world was shifting. 3 major airlines had just announced revisions to their passenger conduct protocols, citing emerging standards of dignity enforcement. 2 international security firms followed suit, hiring independent ethics boards to monitor their profiling and restraint policies. And in Bern, Switzerland, an international summit on racial bias in global travel had been scheduled. Julian declined the invitation to attend. "I don't need to sit in another room where the only outcome is another panel," he had told Darian days earlier. Change isn't always dressed in microphones. Instead, his work unfolded quietly in corners most forgot to visit. At Virulon's headquarters, Marcus Wren stood before the operations team with a clipboard. "Julian's instructed full deployment of Project Aegis," he announced. "We're sending diagnostic units to underserved urban hospitals in 12 cities. Boston, Dayton, Aurora, Flint, all greenlit. This is our first wave." "Is this part of the Cyrex Fund?" someone asked. "Yes," Marcus said, "and the part no one's expecting." Meanwhile, at Crestlane Security, the board had voted in a closed-door session. Every clause of Julian's flight ethics manifesto was passed, without amendment. Not because they'd had a change of heart, but because investors had made their intentions clear: evolve or dissolve. The most vocal push had come from shareholders citing viral backlash and plummeting goodwill metrics. "It's not about guilt," one investor had told Bennett Core, Deltamon's CEO. "It's about survival." He owns the narrative now, and the future doesn't board through bias. At Haven General, a nurse approached Julian after the father had returned to his son's room. "You probably don't hear this enough," she said, holding out a clipboard for him to sign. "But what you've done here, it's already working." Julian nodded politely, signing without flourish. "We're not done." That night, in his office, Marcus found Julian staring out the window overlooking the city, its lights blinking like distant signals. Rain tapped softly against the glass. They passed the final clause, Marcus said. Crest Lane, mandatory officer removal and the profiling restitution fund. It's in. Julian didn't turn around. Not because they wanted to.
No.
Because they had to. A pause. Julian finally spoke. You ever notice how quiet it gets after a rule changes? Marcus leaned against the doorframe. What do you mean? Julian exhaled slowly, his breath briefly fogging the window. Justice, he said, almost in a whisper, isn't a press conference. It's the kind of silence that follows when they realize you rewrote the rulebook while they were still laughing. The question came without warning, cutting through the room like a wire under tension. Do you forgive the officers who pulled you off that plane? Julian Maris paused, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the armrest. The interview was nearly over, just another quiet conversation with a journalist from the Pendrell Times, meant to be reflective rather than explosive. The tape recorder between them blinked with a steady red light, the only sound in the minimalist lounge apart from the distant hum of rain against the windows. The reporter, Callum Dresner, waited, pen hovering over his notebook. He was young, barely in his 30s, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd already seen institutions twist under pressure. Julian had granted this one interview only because Callum had asked with honesty and no rehearsed smile. But that question, it wasn't on the prep sheet. Julian exhaled quietly and looked out the window. No, he said finally, voice steady. Forgiveness is personal. Accountability is public. They can live with both. Callum didn't speak right away. He simply nodded once and clicked his pen shut. The quote, when published, was placed as the final line in an exposé that would ripple across every major outlet within 48 hours. He took the seat they denied and turned it into a standard became the headline, an exposé that traced Julian's path from the humiliation at Gate B12 to his silent acquisition of boardroom power and his sweeping reforms through Virulon's initiatives. The article wasn't sensational. It was surgical. It recounted the exact moment Julian was escorted away, the $5 billion fund redirect, the birth of Project Equitrans, and the growing ripple of policy reforms sweeping the aviation sector. But it was that final quote that detonated. By the end of the week, the phrase had been printed on protest signs, projected onto walls at universities, quoted at business conferences, and even etched onto the base of a new sculpture outside Corvin City Airport. The image accompanying the article, Julian staring calmly out of a plane window, silhouetted by soft cabin light, went viral. But Julian never reposted it. He never commented. He didn't need to. Back at Virulon's headquarters, a quiet shift had already taken place. Julian had declined a televised award from the Global Leadership Council, stating only that the spotlight should shine on those who had never been allowed near the stage. The council, confused but respectful, redirected the honorarium at his request. It now funded full scholarships for underrepresented students pursuing aviation, ethics, or AI policy, fields Julian believed would define not just the skies, but the future itself. During a late evening strategy meeting, Darian Holt leaned back in his chair, eyes on a whiteboard filled with expansion routes for Equitrans. You realize, he said, the whole industry is either terrified or copying you now. Julian gave a faint smile. They can do both, he replied. Darian chuckled, but then grew quiet. That interview, that quote, you really believe they can live with both? Julian looked up, meeting his assistant's gaze. They already are. Elsewhere, critics who had once called Julian too quiet, too restrained, too deliberate, began to shift tone. Not because they changed their minds, but because the tide had changed beneath them. Julian's impact was now structural, not situational. And structure has a way of silencing doubt. That week, Julian received an invitation to keynote a summit in Geneva. Ethics, Power, and Passenger Rights in the 21st Century. He turned it down. Instead, he sent Marcus Wren to speak in his place, along with a note. Change doesn't require my face, just the will to keep building. In his absence, the summit adopted Virulon's Flight Ethics Manifesto as a model framework for international consideration. Julian spent the day of the summit quietly walking through the research wing of Haven Medical, where Virilon's AI diagnostics lab had recently detected an early-stage condition in a 6-year-old boy from an underserved district. Julian didn't attend the press briefing. Instead, he sat in the waiting room with the boy's father, just a man in a suit with no cameras, no reporters. "They said your company caught it before it spread," the father whispered, emotion cracking through his voice. Julian nodded once, then replied softly, "That's the destination I was always flying toward." Later that night, as he returned home, Julian reviewed a memo he had written weeks earlier but never sent, until now. It was brief, a single line at the top, highlighted for his entire leadership team to see. Power doesn't always need to announce itself. Sometimes, it just walks calmly through the fire and rebuilds the building. The boy stared at the plaque in silence, the wind tugging at the edge of his worn backpack. Around him, the other students had already run into the new tech lab, marveling at the gleaming screens and robotic arms. But this boy lingered, eyes locked on the inscription etched in brushed steel. "For every boy told to wait his turn while the plane leaves without him." Behind him, footsteps echoed across the newly paved walkway. Julian Maris approached slowly, the crisp autumn air pressing against his suit jacket. He'd come alone, no cameras, no press, not even Darian this time. Just him and this quiet, returning corner of Calmere Heights. The schoolyard hadn't changed much. Same chain-link fence, same mural of hand-painted stars. But today something new had landed. "Did you build planes?" the boy asked without turning around. Julian knelt beside him, knees cracking faintly from age or burden. It was hard to tell. "Not the kind you sit in," he said, smiling gently. "The kind that can carry your future." The boy nodded, still unsure, still too young to see the weight those words held. But Julian saw it all. The resemblance of memory in the boy's oversized hoodie. The way he stood just far enough from the group to go unnoticed. The world still didn't see promise until it had proof. Inside the glass-paneled tech lab, now christened the runway, a row of donated tablets flickered to life. The school principal, Mr. Cardin, gave a brief speech in the background, thanking Virilon Systems for the transformational contribution. But Julian didn't step up to speak. His message had already been welded into steel. Let them read instead of clap. Back at Virilon HQ that evening, Julian joined Darian Holt and Marcus Wren in the ethics conference room, still under renovation but already buzzing with strategy. "Enrollment hits begin next week," Darian said, scrolling through a projected chart. "We've got 50 applicants confirmed for the pilot cohort. All black, all first-gen founders." Julian nodded once, the only approval they needed. "Call it the Maris Initiative," he said, "and let every session begin with this." He pulled a single image from a folder and slid it across the glass table. A grainy still of himself being escorted off the plane, arms raised slightly in passive confusion, while indifferent eyes watched from behind. Marcus stared. "Are you sure?" "I am," Julian replied. Darian crossed his arms. "It'll make people uncomfortable." Julian looked up. "Good." There was a pause in the room. A deep pause. The kind that meant everyone understood something had just shifted. But no one said it aloud. They spent the next 2 hours structuring the curriculum. Not just lectures on pitch decks and venture capital, but workshops on negotiation under pressure, de-escalation in boardrooms, the psychology of being underestimated, and the science of silent retaliation. Julian had insisted on a framework grounded not just in ambition, but in armor. "You don't rise by chance," he told them. "You rise by clarity." Each course would carry with it not just tools but symbols. A seatbelt from a decommissioned plane. A boarding pass with no name. A screen showing headlines that had once buried names like Julian's under vague excuses. And on the final week, a private Q&A with Julian himself. No filters. No headlines. Just one man answering questions from others still being watched at the gate. Weeks passed, and applications poured in faster than anticipated. Young men with resumes built from nothing but fire and pressure. Some with 3 jobs, others with 2 failed startups and nothing to lose. One of them signed his cover letter, I don't want to be the next Julian Maris. I want to build what no one will believe until it flies. Julian read that letter twice. Then came the call from Halvane Elementary. The tech lab was complete. The equipment installed. Students already learning automation processes that Julian hadn't touched until his second year of college. He returned that Friday. Quietly, he parked 2 blocks away to walk alone. Each street echoed with memories. Cracked sidewalks, rusted fences. The spot where his father once taught him how to fix a broken bike chain using nothing but a dime and discipline. A group of children waved to him through the window of the lab. He waved back but didn't enter. Instead, he walked to the outer wall where the plaque had been installed. Brushed steel. Bold font. Words that spoke more of loss than triumph, but only if you understood what waiting felt like. For every boy told to wait his turn while the plane leaves without him. A gust of wind carried leaves across the yard. One landed at Julian's feet, curled and brittle like an old report never read. Behind him, the same boy from earlier reappeared. "Why'd you name it the runway?" Julian didn't answer at first. He glanced toward the building's clean architecture, the humming tech behind the glass, the future already beginning inside. Then he turned to the boy, his voice low and deliberate. "Because no one told me I was allowed to fly until I stopped asking." The boy blinked, unsure what to say. Julian smiled, not with pride, but with understanding. As the child stepped inside, Julian remained alone on the path. He pulled out his phone, scrolled past a few messages, and paused on one, an internal memo for the Maris Initiative's first keynote slide. It contained only one sentence beneath the image of him being pulled from the plane. He whispered it to himself, as if sealing it to memory. "Remember what silence cost you. Now build a world where your voice costs them comfort." The interns were already lining up. Julian Maris stood near gate B12, the same one where it had all begun. He didn't need to look at the number above the counter. He knew it by heart. It wasn't just a gate anymore. It was a scar. And like any scar, it reminded him not of pain, but of what he'd survived. Across from him, a group of young men, eager, suit-clad, and impossibly hopeful, checked their boarding passes, adjusted their ties, and whispered in hushed tones. Each was a graduate of the Maris Initiative, a year-long mentorship incubator designed to prepare young Black founders to step into rooms that were never built for them. And today, they were on their way to a global summit in Corvin City. Julian wasn't flying. He was simply there to see them off. From behind the counter, the gate agent glanced up and froze. Recognition dawned immediately. Her voice faltered as she stepped forward, trying to steady herself. "Mr. Maris, welcome back," she said softly. Julian gave her a nod, polite but distant. "I'm not boarding today," he replied. "Just here to see someone off." The gate agent swallowed hard and nodded, stepping back into her station. She didn't try to explain or apologize. She knew the history of this place, knew what her company had done, and who he had become because of it. Julian's eyes didn't linger on her. They were fixed on the interns, each one a chapter that had yet to be written. Among them was 17-year-old Rohan Dree, the youngest member of the cohort, wearing a crisp blazer and holding a tablet under one arm like it was a shield. He spotted Julian and beamed. Julian returned a small nod. No speech. No ceremony. As the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, the interns began handing over their passes. Julian stepped farther back, allowing the moment to belong to them. He wanted them to walk through that jet bridge without the weight of his name, without the burden of being seen as a statement. He had already made the statement. 2 businessmen passed nearby, whispering as they recognized him. One murmured, "That's him, the guy from the ethics charter thing, right?" The other nodded slowly. "Yeah." Changed the game. Julian pretended not to hear. His focus remained unmoved, locked on the line of young men now disappearing into the gate. Behind him, a reporter from a small outlet tried to approach, camera slung at his side. "Mr. Maris," he called. "Any thoughts as these interns board?" Julian didn't turn. "Not today. But you're the reason they're here." Julian glanced over his shoulder.
No.
They're the reason I was ever there. The journalist froze as Julian walked away, slow and deliberate. His shoes echoed across the terminal floor, the rhythm unhurried, like someone who finally controlled the tempo of the world around him. Near the window, he paused, just as the aircraft began to move down the tarmac. The sun hit the fuselage at an angle that made the metal gleam like a beacon. The plane ascended seconds later, its shadow shrinking over the concrete, engines roaring in defiance of gravity. Julian's hand slipped into his coat pocket. His posture was calm, but his eyes narrowed slightly with focus, as if taking a mental photograph of the scene. A victory, yes, but not the celebratory kind. The kind you earn after building everything yourself, screw by screw, when the world refused to hand you even the first brick. Behind him, no fanfare.
No camera flashes. No applause.
Only wind, jet exhaust, and silence. He spoke barely above a whisper, but the words were unmistakable. They thought pulling me off the plane would delay me, he murmured. But all it did was show me how to build my own fleet. They pulled the wrong man off the plane and watched their funding disappear by sunset. If you believe dignity costs nothing, but disrespect costs billions, subscribe now. Because justice always lands where the money goes. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It shines a light on racism, prejudice, and the consequences of judging someone by appearance instead of respect. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, equality, and fairness in every level of society.